So yeah, thanks guys for coming. Sorry for making you come at 9:15. I appreciate the early morning. I guess I should start with a kind of confession. I've said this joke to several people already, but this is not a talk about Warhammer. This is a philosophy of fiction talk using Warhammer. So if you want to go, it's open. There's another room just around the corner. But that's the place to start. So I do a bunch of stuff in philosophy of fiction, and my aim with this little talk is I want to explore a specific kind of what we'll call fictional incompleteness. And it's a particular kind that 40K lore is rife with. And this is the notion I'm going to call invitational incompleteness. More on this in about 10 minutes or so. And just for ease, I'm going to treat 40K lore, the fluff, all as one massive fiction. There's a bunch of issues with that, but it's just going to make it easier. It sets a bunch of noise aside if we just treat the whole lore as one big fiction. So the plan, I want to start off by just generally introducing you to fictional incompleteness, because I kind of assume that not many people are super excited about fictional incompleteness. And then I want to talk to you about different flavors that it comes in. And then finally, after kind of pulling apart 3 different flavors, I want to talk finally about the Lost Primarchs and say why the issue about what happened to them, what their deeds were, leads us to a kind of new flavor. And importantly, I don't want to say that 40K is the first kind of fiction to offer this incompleteness, but it's really, really full of it. And it's a wonderful example of it. So that's kind of what I'm going to do, and then we'll finish off by saying where to go from here. Bingo, bango. So let's start with some fictional incompleteness. Fictions, novels, movies, plays, whatever you like, are representational media. And what they represent are often talked about as like fictional worlds or fictional events, fictional characters. They can represent reality, right? You can have a film set in Paris, for example, but that's not really the exciting stuff. The exciting stuff is when it's set in a completely fictional setting. But you might want to know what the hell fictions really are, and there's a long-running kind of project here from Kendall Walton that treats fictions as props in games of make-believe. Specifically, they're objects that are designed to prescribe imaginings. And so there's prescriptions to make believe certain propositions. So my favorite example, which I think is probably my favorite 40K book, in Pharos, it prescribes that readers imagine Mount Pharos is located on Sotha. It prescribes that Barabbas Dantiok is a warsmith, right? These kinds of things. Basically, the book kind of gives you a bunch of things and says, hey, if you want to play this game, you need to imagine these things. No, you can imagine different things. Go read The Hungry, Hungry Caterpillar as something about a greater demon of Nurgle. Go nuts. But there you're kind of abusing the story in a way. You're playing a different game than the one the book sets out for. It's also worth noting that this characterization of fiction is really, 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 really broad. Right? So novels are going to count as fictions. Films are going to count as fictions. Our little figurines are going to count as fictions because they're literally props that we use in games of make-believe. This thing prescribes that he's got a chainsword and a bolter. So again, it's a very broad conception of fiction. And you can imagine that he's got a flamer, but you'd be doing it wrong. What you see is what you get. So, okay, what's true in a fiction? What's the content of a fiction? Well, it's going to be what you're prescribed to imagine. So it's true in Pharos that Mount Pharos is on Sotha, that Dantiok is a warsmith, that he's the best boy, etc., etc., etc. So far, so good? Cool. Now, some interesting things when we think about fictional truths, right? The contents of fiction, is what's the logic here? How is it governed? Now, notably, classical logic assumes that it's complete. The world is complete. That is, for every proposition P, either P or not P is true. Is there an even or odd number of people in the other room? There's a fact of the matter there, even if we don't know it. So notably, this isn't an issue about epistemology. This is just a kind of like, hey, there's either it's true or it's false. But the problem is classical logic does not work for fictions, because fictions are gappy. There's lots and lots of truth value incompleteness here. There's propositions that aren't true or false. And this is just because in a lot of cases, the stuff doesn't matter. Easy example, is it true or false in the 40K fic that Dorn has a mole on his shoulder? It's not true, it's not false, nobody gives a shit, right? It's a gap, it's a gap. So the logic of truth in fiction is going to be gapping. And this is what we call incompleteness, right? Fictions are incomplete. Note the sense of incompleteness I'm after here is truth value incompleteness, right? It's not the case that for every proposition, either it's true or its negation is true. That doesn't mean that they're not complete in the sense of they're finished works. Like the 40K lore is obviously not complete in that sense either, but that's a different kind of project. I'm interested in the truth value gaps. So, cool. Lots of fictions, including the 40K fiction, incomplete in various ways. And there are lots of different ways to be incomplete. So in previous work, we tried to pull apart 3 different types. One way is what we call permissive incompleteness. Permissive incompleteness is literally just, hey, go nuts, fill in the gaps however you want. Right? Do you want to believe that Dorn has a mole on his shoulder? Cool. Do you want to believe he doesn't? Cool. No one cares. You are permitted by the fiction to imagine whatever you like with regards to this proposition. That's kind of the typical one. A slightly more interesting kind of incompleteness is prescriptive or prohibitive incompleteness. And here, there's a gap, but the fiction tells you, do not fill this gap in. You are in fact prohibited from imagining a complete for that truth, that proposition. And I tried to find a 40K example. I couldn't think of one. I'm sure there are plenty. But the example I always come back to is if we go back to the original Blade Runner, the question of whether Deckard is a replicant or a human, that's not meant to be answered by the film. In fact, if you fill that in, you fucked up. The whole point of the film is to leave you guessing about the answer to that. It's prohibitive. You're not supposed to imagine an answer there. You can talk about it, you can talk about the evidence from one way or the other, but the fiction is forcing you to leave it incomplete because that is the point of the film. So hopefully you can see the difference between the 2 types of incompleteness there, right? Permissive, go nuts, fill it in as you like. Prohibitive, look, you are literally being told to not fill this in no matter what. And the last kind of one that I enjoy, and I think this is related to interactive fictions, is the notion of choice incompleteness. So here the fiction basically prescribes P or Q. You've got some options. But it doesn't prescribe any particular option. So the thought here is basically, hey, here are some ways the story can go. Pick which way you want the story to go. That's still filling in. The story itself is incomplete. It's only once you engage with it that it starts to fill out these options. The really, really easy example of this, choose your own adventure books. Choose your own adventure books. I don't know if people have played or read the Path to Victory books. It's between friends, they're not. But in these cases, the fictions themselves are incomplete until you play them. And once you play them, you, in some sense, start to fill in the gaps, right? You pick, okay, yeah, I'm going to go down the hallway and chase after the Tyrion. And when you make this choice, what you do is kind of pick a path. Notably, if you don't make a choice, if you don't fill in the gap, then the story fails. And notably, it doesn't fail in the sense that it kind of comes to a natural conclusion or a canonical end. The storytelling act just sort of fizzles out and dies. So again, hopefully you can kind of see the difference between these 3 types. Okay, so that's the long-ass run-up to finally talk back again about the Lost Primarchs. So, what happened to the Forgotten and the Purged? Well, the fiction doesn't answer it. And in fact, it's very clear about not answering. This is a very clear instance of fictional incompleteness in this big 40K fiction. Notably, it doesn't prescribe any particular event that happened, but it does tell you that something happened. So in that sense, it's gapping. You can't discharge the existential, if you would put it that way. You know, something happened. What was it? Who fucking knows? We're not allowed to talk about it. The interesting thing about this form, or this instance of incompleteness, is it doesn't seem to match the three that I mentioned before. It's not permissive, because not only does the fiction not settle it, but it's very explicit when you think about the people talking about the fiction that you are not meant to settle. This is an open question. So this is from an interview with Rick Priestley. He says that it was always intended to be something unknown, stuff that begs questions for which there could be no answer. And another instance, Aaron Dembski-Bowden posting on Reddit. The important one is the third little paragraph here. He says, to be clear, it's not a case of we know the answer and we're not allowed to say accepting hints. It's a case of there is no answer at all, and there's not allowed to be an answer. So this is very clearly not permissive. You're not supposed to fill this in. It's not like Doran's Mole where you can kind of do whatever you want. It's more like it's a prohibited case. But it's also not like a prohibited case in that it does kind of, well, as Priestley said, it begs questions. It kind of invites you to answer the question in a way that I think the kind of Deckard being a human or replicant thing doesn't. It's not like the point of the 40K lore is to get you to think about, oh, what happened to the Forgotten and the Purged. This is just another kind of weird mystery along the way. And similarly, it's not a kind of choice in completeness because it's very clear that not filling this in doesn't cause the fiction or the storytelling to fizzle out. It's not like a choose your own adventure case either. So it's incomplete, but it's not incomplete in the way that we talked about just a few minutes ago. So what the hell is it? Well, I think it's this special kind of incompleteness. We'll call it invitational. And it's invitational in the sense that, right, readers are prescribed to not imagine a particular answer. You're supposed to leave it gappy. That's again what we got from Dembski-Bowden and from Priestley. Don't fill in the gap within the fiction. The fiction's content is going to remain gappy here. But you are invited to kind of fill it out in some other way. And the way you're invited to fill it out is via constructing what we'll call paratexts. Paratext, I assume many people come across this notion before, is basically a text, right, that's sort of parasitic or attached to a main text, and it changes or filters the way you engage with the main text. Let's Plays are a very good example of paratexts. Actually, one of the things that's going on in the other room, right, they're talking about fan fiction. Fan fiction is an instance of a paratext. You literally like inherit a bunch of things, add your own story, and that's supposed to change how you engage with the larger fiction. So I think what's going on with this question about what happened to the Lost Primarchs is an instance of that kind of thing. It's basically asking you, hey, don't fill in the gaps in the story itself, but develop a paratext. Come up with your own story. Come up with your own fiction. And these paratexts, these fictions can take many forms. Headcanons. Oh my God, so many fucking YouTube videos about what happened to the Lost Primarchs. Google it and see how many you get. Right? Every single Warhammer kind of YouTuber has at least 2 videos on this thing. Long Reddit posts. Again, quickly going to find it. But slightly more interestingly, these fictions can take forms that are relevant to associated extra-fictional matters. Because the 40K fiction is, of course, attached to other stuff, the game, the hobby. And these associated tabletop gaming and modeling elements are also ways for us to build paratexts. Because remember, those count as fictions too, in this very broad concept of fiction. So what we can do, and in fact, I think what these sorts of questions, like what happened to the Lost Primarchs do, is they invite you to develop your own paratext. In this case, do some modeling, make your own legion, make your own Primarch, go nuts, right? But importantly, in all of these, they're not part of, in some sense, the 40K fiction canon. There's something that's out there in this weird, nebulous, extra-fictional elements, and they're related, but they're not actually part of the canon itself. The fiction remains gappy. History remains. Just like James D. Wildman said, there is no answer, and you cannot know it. And what's really cool, I think, about 40K fiction is that it is full of these sorts of things. There's so many questions here that we are invited to think about, but the fiction is by design never going to answer. Some favorite ones of mine: what's the genetic heritage of Minotaurs? Where do they come from? Is Indrid a former Thunderbird? Who's my absolute favorite character? Doesn't get to really do a whole lot, but it's really fun and cool. Who's Subject 11 in the Vaults of Terra? Some ones from yesterday. How did St. Catherine die? So that was one of the questions that came up in, I think, the second talk yesterday. Another one that was kind of related to earlier talk about philosophy technology. What the hell were the men of stone? We have one story that talks about the men of gold, the men of stone, and the men of iron. What the hell were the men of stone? These are questions that, again, the fiction isn't going to solve. It's incomplete, it's gappy. But I think it's inviting you to try and say some stories here. Fill the gaps in with your paratexts. So again, I think there's this neat, new, little different kind of incompleteness. It's not permissive, it's not prohibitive, it's certainly not choice. It looks different. Okay, so that's the sales pitch. Let's just kind of wrap up by thinking about some kind of objections, kind of challenges we might raise. Right? So one of them is, of course, that the idea that I'm leaning in, that it's inviting you to construct a paratext, requires that there's a kind of canon text, non-canon text distinction, and famously or infamously, there is no canon. Yeah, okay, cool. I think even if you grant that there is no canon, there's enough of a sense of kind of canonicity versus mere headcanon that we can do the job that I need to do to talk about this kind of completeness. A second kind of slightly more interesting worry, and this comes back to a couple of the talks yesterday, thinking about how to formulate the 40K canon, is that these invited paratexts could become canon. So the 40K fic is a collaborative one that's multi-author. It's serial in the sense that it's constantly changing. Later things can retcon what happened before. So what could turn out to be, hey, just some kind of effectively like fanfic that I wrote could be incorporated later. And that's interesting, because that suggests that something could be kind of invitational incompleteness at one instance, and then not actually a form of that later on. But that's just because serial fictions, in this sense of kind of ones that allow for retconning and changing after the fact, are really weird. How to make sense of truth in fiction for these is a huge problem in general. Yeah, so it's a problem, but it's a bigger problem. That's not a problem for this. And the last thing I guess I want to talk about is, does invitational incompleteness, this kind of general concept, does it require there being extra fictional elements the fiction's associated with, right? So the 40K fiction is rife with this kind of thing because there's the associated games and modeling. But is every fiction that has this kind of incompleteness going to require that extra stuff too? And I'm genuinely not sure. Possibly, but it seems feasible to me that there'll be fictions that don't have associated extra fictional bits, but could still have this invitational incompleteness, inviting you for paratexts. I'm not sure exactly what they would look like, but yeah, I think these are the things that I want to look at next. So anyway, wrapping it up, I tried to say fictional incompleteness comes in lots of different forms, and then trying to argue that a 40K fiction taken as this big monolithic block is an excellent example of one specific form, this invitational incompleteness, which is distinct from permissive, prohibitive, and choice. And it's distinct because what it does is it invites readers to construct these paratexts, these effectively fan fictions that are attached as riders to the overall fiction. So that's me done. Duty honorably discharged. Thank you very much.